Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the My Football Writer YouTube channel, and welcome back to the big question. Once again, it's been revived. I'm Freddie Humphrey Wakefield, and I'm here with Jack Wright. And today's big question regarding Norwich is, well, of course, the season's just happened, and it was a bit mediocre. So the big question today is, how did Norwich City manage to suffer another year of underperformance? But before we dive into that question and the reasons as to maybe why that happened, Jack, what's been going on with you in your life?
Yeah, not enough, not a lot. Thanks, Freddie. It's just really hot down here in Essex. I really wanted to take my laptop outside and work in the sunshine, but unfortunately, my Wi-Fi doesn't go that far. That is as exciting as my life is, unfortunately, not being able to go and suntan. I'm going on holiday soon. I'm going to South Africa, so hopefully that'll be nice and hot. But knowing my luck, it'll probably be rainy and horrible.
Yeah, no, maybe it will. No, you might see a few. If you see Diego Forlan out there, tell him I say hi after his amazing World Cup there about 15 years ago. But anyhow, we'll stop. Well, if only Norwich had a player like Diego Forlan, that'd be quite nice. Maybe we would be having a bit of a different conversation about the season just gone by. But really, the first sort of thing you go into of Norwich's season, what you begin at the beginning. You look at Norwich at the start of the season. You know, they had some decent performances around the start, especially within September to October. You look at performances against Hull, where they won 4-0. They beat Watford 4-1. There was encouraging games against Sheffield United and Blackburn, who nearly both ended up in the playoff spots. So, you know, given that those performances were so good at the start of the season, you could argue there's quite a bit of concern that that sort of level wasn't it replicated as much throughout the rest of the season. You know, you think with a project like what Norwich had, it would have started off really poorly, and then towards the end of the season is where it picks up and you start seeing performances that are pleasing on the eye and make you believe in it, and you think, right, well, next year, you know, we'll give this a proper go, and it'll be good fun next season because we've figured out who works and who doesn't. But at the end of the campaign, especially the latter end, you know, Norwich ended the season with, what was it, 2 wins in 12. They were appalling, absolutely appalling. So I guess that's really the first big point, really, as to why it was another year of underachieving. I guess just a lack of consistency, and at the end of it all, they just fell apart. They just didn't look interested, in all honesty.
Yeah, and obviously that kind of really good start, I think it kind of gave us a bit of false hope because I think the performances on the whole were very good. At times, obviously, one of the key factors during that period that you mentioned, kind of September, October, that was when Borja Sainz really decided to get his scoring boots on. Um, and then, I think it's a really bizarre drop off in the kind of late October, November time. It was exactly when I went on honeymoon. It was exactly when I went on holiday. I was away for, I think, 3 weeks, and we were saying this, that I don't think Norwich won in that space of time. That's when we kind of lost to Cardiff very late on, and embarrassingly lost to Bristol City and lost our long unbeaten home record. Yeah, I think it is just kind of frustrating in that regard because again you keep that consistency going. Um, you know that playoff push that we were all kind of thinking is definitely on, and I think even when you look at the good spell just after Christmas, I do remember directly at the start of February was when we were looking ahead and thinking, right, winnable games, winnable opposition, a lot of favorable matches at home, especially if we're going to charge into the top six, this is our moment. And I think that kind of stumble in February really kind of dislodged us, really kind of perturbed us, and then it properly started going downhill sort of from March onwards. People sort of point the finger at that late concession at Blackburn if we win and Ante Cernat scores the winning goal, does the entire drop off in form not happen? Yeah, it probably still does. Did the players kind of all feel demotivated that they weren't going to be in with a shout at the top six? Maybe. I mean, obviously you've got players like Sainz and Sargent who have had brilliant seasons, and maybe towards the end they thought, oh well, if we're not in with a shout of actually going up and obtaining the prize of Premier League football, I'll kick the ball around for a few matches and then wait for my next paycheck in the summer. That's ultimately a factor, but I think when we kind of look at the big question as a whole, obviously we'll delve into it a bit kind of later, but I think if you're looking for one reason or one factor to be kind of culpable with our downfall, it is the injuries. It is the amount of times that we had to reshuffle teams, the amount of times that George Long had to play in goal. It is, you're almost saying it is a bit of a joke, but I don't think we won a single game where he was in goal other than the second half of the game against Hull. The fact that he was essentially dropped from even the bench towards the end of the season, is indicative of just how many points we were dropping when he was in goal. I'm not saying George Long is the reason why we failed this season, but, his inclusion is obviously reflective of the absences that we've had, the kind of lack of depth that we've had. And I think I alluded to it in sort of other podcasts, is that, looking back on Napa's business, there's not that many hits compared to misses. The misses, unfortunately, are overwhelming.
No, there is. A lot of them were quite poor. I was going to ask you really sort of next about your standpoint on the recruitment. Do you think the jury is still out, or is it, were you happy with how it went? Was it more a disaster? I think for myself, I'm very much in the camp that the jury is still out because they're all so young. Apart from what Marcondes, I think every signing was 24 years old or younger, which for any team is absurd. There's so few teams who do that as their business, and unless you get some of the most amazing young talents who no one else knows about, you don't stand a chance of them coming in and taking the world by storm. The only player who really did that, you could argue, at the start of the season was Callum Doyle, but he had already had what was it, 2 or 3? Well, he had 3 loan spells prior, promoted in every single one of them. It speaks serious levels about Callum Doyle. He wasn't promoted with Coventry, but he got to a playoff. He got in the playoffs with them, I believe. So, he had incredible seasons. Everyone knew about Callum Doyle when he came in and how good of a player he would be. Maybe some players sort of hit the ground running a little bit, but then just performance levels dipped majorly. So I guess that sort of impacts, a few opinions on the transfer window. You think of Slimani, for instance. We were purring at how good he was after he came in. I think every Norwich fan was saying, how on earth did Sheffield United let him go to us for £1 million? This guy is incredible. How did he not get in their team given how bad they were last year? And then he became a permanent player, came back from injury, and you could argue, you could see why Anis Slimane wasn't getting in a Sheffield United team that got 20 odd points. He just levels dipped massively. I think every player apart from probably Sargent had their performance levels dip in the second half of the season. I think that was a big factor. But to go back to what I was going to ask you, just what was your standpoint on the recruitment? Were you happy? Are you really fuming at it, or do you just give it a bit more time because they're young lads?
I mean, first and foremost, the transfer strategy in the summer obviously was completely different to the season before, where we were very much focused on those experienced heads, Danny Bart, Adam Forshaw, Ashley Barnes, Christian Fastnat. And there's probably, there's no surprise that those players aren't here anymore. And ultimately, one of the jobs that Napa had in the summer was to replace the stars from the previous season, and replace them, with better replacements. Which, when you're trying to find an improvement on Gabriel Sara, when you're trying to find an improvement on Jonathan Rowe, and you're even trying to find an improvement on Dimi Yanulis, I don't think did Cresceni really kind of prove to be a better option than Dimi. Would we have rather had Dimi? Probably. I don't think we would have ever been able to afford a Gabriel Sara like for like, let alone someone that was going to improve on that. Again, with the Rowe one, I don't think he really anticipated Rowe going. And that right wing position never really properly got filled. We loaned Cade Gordon, who was really off the boil. Jurasek, bless him, whatever's going on there hasn't worked out. But yeah, I think your point of is the jury out on these signings? I'm going back through the list in my head of all the signings that we've made, and all of them have had injury blows throughout the season. Like poor Amankwa Forson, he was out fairly early on in the season. Obviously, as we've said, Jurasek, Slimani, like you said, got injured, and then his performances dipped. Cernats, when he was starting to show that £7 million quality, then was out pretty much until the end of the season. I think, again, it with this whole sort of transition logic, it very much fitted that. It very much fitted the narrative of, oh, don't worry if these players aren't good now, they'll be good next season. Someone like a Schwartau, for instance, came in, and I don't think he had any pressure on him, because it was like, oh, he's 18. Like, okay, he cost £3 million, but we're being told he'll be great next season. I think the pressure will be on a lot of these young players next campaign. But obviously the question is, will they stay fit? That's a whole different question in its own. But yeah, the most consistent signings were probably Marcondes, and in January, Jacob Wright. And yeah, fingers crossed we can retain him. It's sounding positive. We don't know yet. But even so, if you maybe got Wright holding the midfield without a McLean, McConville in the defence without a Duffy, Schwartau in the midfield, without a Nunez, and a Cernats up front without a Sargent. Again, is that better than this kind of current team? Or are we then in a situation where, oh, don't worry about next season, don't worry about 25, 26, 26, 27 is one we're going to cook? It does feel a little bit like that. But yeah, I mean, a lot of the signings have had brilliant individual games. I mean, Cordoba had a fantastic little spell sort of around January, February time, where we thought he would really kick on, and then completely his performances went off a cliff. So yeah, if they had all stayed fit and contributed throughout the season, we wouldn't be sat here saying, the big problem was strength and depth. But alas, there's something going on with our strength and conditioning, quite frankly, because I said it throughout the season. Maybe we need some more ibuprofen or some more plasters, because we're all a bit poorly.
No, they were. No, they were. I think completely agree with your point of you think of every Norwich signing this season, and they did. They pretty much all had massive injuries. They had prolonged spells out, which is quite amazing actually at how many injuries Norwich had. That was a big thing of, the last episode, a big question I did on my own. I was all about why have Norwich struggled so much, and that was really the main thing for me was we never had our best team at a constant disposal. And, maybe Norwich would have really kicked on with their best team constantly at Johannes Torup's disposal. But lo and behold, they didn't. And, they tried to adapt, but just as you mentioned, didn't have the depth whatsoever. Norwich's second choice team is significantly worse, in majority of positions, which is a shame. It really sort of exacerbates the fact that Norwich have nowhere near enough depth. But you go on to perhaps another point here about sort of why the season was a poor one and where maybe it went a bit wrong. And you look at, very recently, before Thorup was sacked, 3 days pretty much before he was sacked, there was the Portsmouth game, and Chris Gorham comes up to him and he asks him about Zoe Webber's programme notes. And anyone who knows about this knows exactly where I'm going. Zoe Webber goes, "We wanted top 6. We didn't achieve it." Johannes Thorup is asked, "What did you think of that?" He is bemused. He didn't know what to say. It seemed as if he wasn't told that. But then you go to his comments at the start of his tenure. He says that a team like Norwich should always be in the top 6. And that's what Ben Napper has gone on to say recently, that Norwich, the aim was top 6 and Norwich should be there. So you look at that. Was it perhaps that there genuinely was a falling out there and there was something about it which, maybe hindered Torup's relationship, perhaps? Or was it really, did Torup lower his expectations after a poor year? Did he sort of assess what had occurred and looked at what he had and thought, you know what? Why did I think this? Why did I ever think I would get top 6 with this team? No one knows how they want me to play. I've done a bit more pragmatic approaches in different games. You look at quite a few away games, especially the Burnley one we watched together on the channel. What Norwich play, we were told that this would be an entertaining team that always looked for the next goal. That Burnley game, they didn't want to get a goal. It was said by Torup after the match, he wanted to wait 45 minutes, see where Norwich were, and bring on the big guns, and then they would attack the game. So it's just bizarre. But what do you think of it? Was it genuinely there was just a misunderstanding between the manager and his bosses, or did Torup just sort of go over the season and think, why on earth was I told this? This was never going to happen?
It's so bizarre. It's really quite weird. And I think it's ultimately it comes down to a matter of semantics of I wasn't told that we should be in the top 6. I was told that we could get in the top 6, or, it's top 6 or bust. Maybe that's what he thought the question was, because I think generally speaking, I think even Napper said it in his presser, if Norwich had have finished 7th or 8th, that wouldn't have been the end of Johannes Thorup. And I think if we had have finished 7th and we'd have sacked him, it would have been quite ridiculous and quite cutthroat. I think crucially, what Napper pinpointed in his response was the fall off in performance towards the tail end of the season. That is the reason. So something has gone on behind the scenes there. Obviously, the amount of turmoil that Torup and Napper had to deal with, early on in the season, at least, Jonathan Rowe handing in a transfer request, and then Abu Kamara handing in a transfer request, and then Narcis Palach going off to Stoke and having to bring Jack Wilshere in. Maybe it was a case of, the whispers of Torup losing the dressing room. He is still a relatively young manager. What is he, like 35 or 36, I think? And you've got players in there like Shane Duffy and Kenny McLean, who are probably only 3 or 4 years younger than him. And maybe they had some suggestions on how to play English football. Maybe instead of bringing in Glenn Riddersholm as an assistant, 2 Danish football experts, as his second and right-hand man, it should have been someone who knows the English game in and out. You could say that's Jack Wilshere, but he knows the under-18s game very well. I'm not saying bring in Alan Irvine. I'm not saying Alan Irvine was the solution, but someone of that ilk, maybe, to come in and just be like, no, Johannes, like you can't do this. It's not, we're not playing against Brøndby or someone like that. No, we're playing away at Oxford, and they're going to kick the stuffing out of you. But yeah, I think the expectations of the season, it should be pretty clear, and I think Torup kind of backpedaling on it was a bad move for him personally, because I think he thus publicly undermined Ben Napper. He, by that comment of being like, "Oh, I don't know what you're talking about," made it seem like the hierarchy are not communicating, are a bit clueless, and there is no plan. Whether that is the truth or not, we'll wait and see when we have a new manager appointed and how good that manager will be, and ultimately next season. Yeah, I think he was skating on thin ice, and then I think you make public comments like that, and it makes the situation all the more difficult.
No, it does. It most certainly does. No, you can never. Well, in any job, you can't really disagree with what your boss's expectations are of you, and expect to keep your job in the morning. And Thorup didn't. Right the day after Millwall, it was hilarious. You and Henry said to me at the Den on Easter Monday, if Thorup goes tomorrow, I don't think I'd be that bothered. Lo and behold, he went the day after, and well. I wouldn't say we weren't bothered. I think, so there was a lot of different opinions. There were people who wanted it a long time before. There were people who didn't want it at all. There were maybe some who thought the jury was still out and they were just going to wait it out and eventually see what happened. And, whatever would have occurred if he stayed Norwich boss would have occurred. But based off that and how Norwich ended up quite mediocre and all the different all the different circumstances that perhaps cost Torup his job, or ultimately led it just to be, look, this is not going right for you. It's not going right for us. Even though there's 2 games left, you need to go. It's just not worked. So, what do you think the sacking is justified? Because there was the whole talk of this is going to take its time. We've got this 3-year plan with him to go into to eventually be a Premier League team, and then a year into the plan, you sack it off. Well, in more ways than one. You sack the man who you believed would get you there, and you took a chance on, and now he goes. What do you think? Do you think the sacking was justified? I mean, for myself, I think based off the end of the season, I think it is, because football is a results-based business, as everyone says. And there was no other sort of factor really at the time that maybe led to him losing his job. It was 1 win in 10. Norwich were bottom of the form table. So what more can you do? Ultimately, in football, it all pins on the manager rather than anything else. And that led to it. So I think it's fair in that regard. In terms of the other factors we've spoken about, I think it was harsh. I felt for him, even though I thought it was perhaps the right decision based off the direction Norwich were going in. I think it was perfectly fair enough to sack him. But that's not to say that I'm not over the moon, or I'm happy that Norwich are looking for a new head coach. But what do you think? Was that for you based off our whole big question here of why did Norwich end up underperforming once again in the season? But after all of those factors, do you think it was fair?
Football is becoming an increasingly cutthroat business, and the more times that you spend outside of the Premier League, the more years that you are in the Championship, the further and further you drift away. So ultimately, the kind of feeling of, oh, we can be patient, we can wait, let it simmer, let it stew, let us cook slowly. And then eventually, when Manchester City and Manchester United and all the big teams have, teams that are twice as good as they already are now, then we'll make it to the Premier League and maybe get like 10 points. What was the plan if it was to, if he was to stay on for the last 2 games? Would there have been a really deep conversation like now as to whether the next season would work? I think ultimately for Napa, one of the big fears is that we go into the summer. He's, helped craft a team along with the Atanasio's money, a new squad with fantastic star players that will hopefully stay fit, fill up his arsenal and, make a really good team. And then by September, October, it collapses again and we're in the same cycle. Does he then buckle at that point? At that point when you're kind of thinking, no, you've had like 3 transfer windows to try and prove us wrong, and it's still not working. It is a huge undertaking trying to get this football club back to the Premier League. I think it was maybe just, is he confident that this team under Johannes Thorup next season will do it? Yeah, I mean, the writing was on the wall. And I think, obviously, we've spoken a lot about the injuries at the start of the season really impacting the team. Okay, in that bad spell in March and April, Gunn was in and out of the team. We didn't really have an established left back, and we were kind of improvising who would be on the right-hand side. But apart from that, we had Sargent up front, we had Steins, we had Nunez, we had Duffy and Cordoba, and Fisher and Stacey for part of it. So the injury crisis was sort of slowly continuing, but it wasn't as extensive. And I don't think it was enough of an excuse that form to be bottom of the form table was inexcusable. I think at the same time we sacked Torup only a couple of days after West Brom sacked Tony Mowbray. So I think maybe Napa looked at the back of his newspaper and thought, oh, they're making action. They want to change something up. Maybe we should. I don't know. Should we? Yeah, like I said, for it to happen 2 games out from the end of the season, something really quite diabolical must have happened. And maybe, in years to come, in an autobiography or a podcast episode with someone else, we'll figure it out. But for now, we're just guessing. But was it harsh? I mean, at the time we did a reaction video on it, and I think what I basically said was that my sentiment is that I like giving managers time. I don't really back the kind of Watford-esque approach of just being like, oh, well, you lost 2 games in a row, or we're going to sack you. No manager is perfect. And in terms of the manager that we appoint, we're not going to be able to appoint a perfect manager. We're just going to have to appoint one that vaguely fits the style, that gets the best out of young players. Yeah, and one that, has at least a plan B, because I think you could say that about Farker, you could say it about Torup. They were very good at plan A, but when plan A failed, the fullback option was just chaos.
No, it was. It was yeah, just a chaotic season really in all accounts. There was very high highs and there were extremely low lows. You did on your Twitter page, for those who haven't seen it, you did a vibeometer about the whole season, and it was just like that the whole season, just up and down and up and down. Well, like a roller coaster, funnily enough. But no, I guess sort of to finish it off, we'll go back to this episode's big question and ultimately answer it. A bit like an English essay. You go back to the question at the end and you answer it in full. So, Jack, in your opinion, why did Norwich have another season of underachievement?
George Long. No. No. That's not that. Like I said, that's not the answer. I think we always knew that it was going to be a drop off from last season. We were never going to be able to replicate the points and the performances, even under David Wagner, a coach that we really despised and really enjoyed to see leave. But again, we were very much on board for a season of patience, but at times really good football. I think the away form within that has to play a huge part. An away form that has historically always been terrible for us. Obviously, when your away form is diabolical, your home form needs to be good in order to back that up. Obviously, in this campaign, that long unbeaten run at home was broken, and along with that, some really humiliating results at home followed. So yeah, I think it was a tough act to follow, and I think I genuinely put it down to that March and April spell. I think you don't collapse and you don't lose your heads, and you just knuckle down, fight as a team, retain some consistency, and you probably go to Home Park and get 3 points. You play Portsmouth at home, who have a terrible away record, and that is a comfortable win where we probably score 5 or 6. Even Millwall, yes, they were chasing the playoffs, but we are a superior side in terms of the personnel. Middlesbrough, with absolutely nothing to play for their playoff ambitions, that could have been an opportunity for us to really kick on. I think the final, kick in the teeth was that tease of a win against West Brom, where we finally, we thought, oh, maybe, just maybe, but maybe not, but maybe. If those, that level of kind of organization, togetherness, if that had been shown in the remainder of the games, then would we have made the playoffs? Maybe not. Would we have made 7th or 8th? Probably. Would that have been deemed on par with where we expected? Absolutely. Would we have been disappointed? Probably not. Would we have been optimistic going into next season? Absolutely. And I think players like Sainz and Sarge, with the Atanasio's money, if we were just outside the playoffs, they might be able to see a pathway where, the playoffs and then the Premier League is a possibility. 13th in the division, that's going to take, a lot of turning around in order to try and convince those players that we're going to be a Premier League outfit within 2 or 3 seasons. And, we're a patient bunch. We're willing to wait, but as long as, we have nice football to watch on the way, and we don't lose to them a lot, we're absolutely fine.
Well, don't know if I don't know if I agree with that last little bit of we're a patient bunch, but no, well, there's no better way to test it now other than next season. Really, Norwich have to really reassess where they are and have a massive summer. Whoever this new head coach is has got a major job on their hands. But for me, really, to answer this episode's question, why did Norwich have another year of underachievement? I think, it is, like I said, with why they struggled so much. When I did the last episode, this side never had its best 11 out. Ultimately, it was a rarity that there was the exact same starting 11, and that only hindered what Torup was trying. In whenever he had a game where he truly stuck to his philosophy and the identity he wanted to make with the Norwich side, he just never had the same 11 players to pick to do it. He never truly learned his best team. And, before he really had the chance to, by the end of the season, and reassess it for next year, which is what everyone maybe thought would happen, he had no longer had his job. So I think that was just the biggest issue ultimately. That you can say it's excuses and it's sort of it's butterfly effect of, oh well, if this player didn't get injured, this happens, then this occurs, and Norwich do this, that, and the other. But no, I think that was it. It just hindered massively by a lack of depth, which maybe is down to poor recruitment. You can look at it from a load of different angles in that, but for me, Norwich ultimately underachieved because they didn't have the right weapons at their disposal. What was it Stuart Webber said a few years ago? We went to war without a gun. I think that actually has come back, and it's quite apt for this Norwich season. But who knows? Maybe, like he said, the year after we'll get our tank and our bazooka, and we'll see what happens. But anyway, this has been the big question as Jack gets his big bicep out on our screens here on the MFW YouTube channel. It's goodbye for now, and we'll see you for the next video of ours here on YouTube.